The meal was not much. That was the first thing Samuel Adeyemi would have told you if you had asked him about it, though no one had ever asked. Because the only two people present that evening already knew what it was and what it had cost, and the conversation between them had not required that particular acknowledgement. It was rice and a small portion of the black-eyed peas his wife had cooked the previous night. Enough for one person's dinner, the last of what the kitchen held, set on the table in the way that you set something in front of another person when you have decided they need it more than you do, and have stopped calculating whether you can afford the decision. The man Samuel fed that evening was sitting on the road that ran past Samuel's farm in Ogun State, Nigeria, in the dry heat of the summer of 1999. He was not quite collapsed, but he was close to it, sitting with his back against the low fence line that marked the edge of Samuel's property, his feet on the unpaved road, his head dropped forward in the specific way of a person whose body has been pushing through something for too long and has simply run out of what it takes to push further. He was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in clothes that had begun the journey in better condition than they had arrived, and he had a bag beside him that suggested he had been traveling for some distance and had not planned for the specific difficulty of what the last part of the journey had required. Samuel had seen him from the field, a figure that had not been there in the morning and was there by late afternoon, and had walked over in the unhurried way that he did most things, crossing the dry season grass with the particular ease of a man who had been working land for 30 years and moved through it with the accumulated knowledge of someone who knew every variation of what the ground could be under different conditions. He had not said anything when he got to the fence. He had looked at the man for a moment, and then he had asked, in Yoruba, whether he was all right. The man had looked up. He was not Yoruba. He was from somewhere in the north. Samuel could see this from his features and from the way he received the Yoruba question, with recognition but not fluency, and Samuel had shifted without ceremony to the English that served as the common language between Nigerians of different regions when they found themselves needing to communicate without a shared native tongue. The man's name was Abubakar Musa. He had been traveling for 3 days from Kaduna, trying to reach Lagos, where he had been told there was work with a construction company that had recently gotten a government contract and was looking for skilled workers, and Abubakar was a skilled worker, had spent 8 years working construction in the north and had references and a specific kind of knowledge that was worth something if he could get to the place where it was needed. He had run out of money on the second day and had been walking and sometimes catching rides in the backs of trucks and eating as he could for the last 30 hours. And what he could was not enough, which was evident from the specific way his body was sitting on the road beside the fence. Samuel had looked at him for another moment after hearing this. The full picture of the situation assembled in his mind without drama. A man from the north traveling south for work who had run out of food and money and was sitting by a fence in the dry season afternoon. He had not said anything about the meal, had not announced any decision or asked any question about whether Abubakar was hungry, because the answer to that question was visible without being asked, and the asking of it would have served only to make the situation more formal than it needed to be, more like a transaction than what it was actually going to be. He had simply said, "Come with me," and turned and walked back toward the house, not waiting to see if Abubakar would follow, because he had understood that the offer of help loses something when it hesitates. And Abubakar had gotten up and followed him. Inside the house, Samuel had told his wife, Adenola, that they had a guest, and Adenola, who was a woman of the specific kind, who received information and moved from it rather than stopping to discuss it or ask clarifying questions she did not actually need answered, had looked at the state of the man who followed Samuel through the door, assessed in a single glance what was needed and in what order, and set the table and put the food out with the same practiced efficiency she brought to everything, and then gone to visit a neighbor down the road, which she did partly because there was genuinely a thing she had been meaning to do there, and partly because she understood, without anyone telling her, that a man who had been traveling hard for 3 days and had not eaten properly needed to eat without the specific discomfort of having an audience for his hunger. Samuel sat with Abubakar while he ate, not making anything of the eating, Not watching in the way that makes a hungry person self-conscious, but simply present, available for conversation or silence depending on what Abu Bakr needed. He did not eat himself. He had a glass of water, and he sat across the table and they talked about the construction work in Lagos, about the contract Abu Bakr had heard about and the specific skills he had, about the road south and what it was like this time of year. Samuel listened the way he listened to most things, with the full attention of a man who had never been in a hurry to reach the end of anything. When Abu Bakr finished eating, he sat with the empty plate for a moment, and then he looked at Samuel with the specific expression of someone who has just received more than they expected and is not sure what the appropriate response to that is. He said he did not know how to thank him. Samuel said there was no need. Abu Bakr said he wanted to repay the meal, that when he got to Lagos and got the work, he would send money. Samuel said that was not necessary either, that a man needed to eat when he was hungry, and that was all there was to it. Abu Bakr had looked at him for a moment. Then he had said, "I will not forget this." He said it in the specific way that people say things they mean as more than a social formula, looking directly at Samuel with the kind of eye contact that carries actual weight, as a statement of intent rather than courtesy. Samuel had nodded, the nod of a man who received the statement as what it was without adding anything to it, and said that he was welcome to sleep on the porch if he needed to rest before continuing, and Abu Bakr had done this, sleeping for 4 hours in the evening cool under the same sky he had been walking under for 3 days, before rising and gathering his bag and continuing south. Samuel had not thought much about it after that. This was not because he was an unfeeling man, but because he was a practical one, and the practical reality was that he had fed a hungry traveler and sent him on his way, and this was the kind of thing that happened sometimes and did not require extended reflection. He had told Adunola what there was to tell when she came back from the neighbor's house, and Adunola had said it was the right thing and made dinner from what she could put together, which was not much, and they had eaten and gone to bed. The 20 years that followed were the 20 years of Samuel and Adunola's life in the way that all years are the years of a life, containing what they contained without asking permission to contain it, good seasons and bad ones, the births of 3 children and the death of the youngest at age 4, from a fever that came fast in the night and was gone by morning in the terrible way of fevers that take children, leaving no room for anything to be done, which was the kind of loss that a person carries differently from other losses. Not in a place you visit, but in a place that is always present. A permanent change in the interior geography of a person that most people learn not to touch directly, because touching it directly makes it impossible to continue doing the things that need to be done. The farm had good years when the rains came right and difficult years when they did not. And Samuel had managed the farm, and Adunola had managed the household, and their 2 surviving children had grown up and left, the daughter to a university in Lagos, and the son to an apprenticeship with an electrician in Abeokuta, and Samuel and Adunola had grown older in the way that people grow older on farms, which is to say faster and more physically than people who do other kinds of work. By 2019, Samuel was 67 years old. The farm was smaller than it had been, not because he had sold land, but because his body could no longer manage the full acreage that it had managed at 45. And he had accepted this with the specific equanimity of someone who has spent a lifetime in practical negotiation with reality, and has learned to revise what he expects of himself when revision is what the situation requires, without drama and without extended grieving for the version of himself that could do more. Adunola was 63 and had the particular energy of a woman who has been in motion for 40 years and does not quite know how to be otherwise. Though she had learned to direct it into smaller circuits as the farm required less of her, finding the smaller circuits contained as much as the larger ones had, in different and sometimes better ways. They were not struggling. Exactly. But they were not comfortable in any way that had margin in it. And the difference between not struggling and having margin was one that Samuel understood clearly and thought about more than he mentioned to Adunola, who thought about it just as much and mentioned it just as infrequently, both of them having arrived somewhere in their 60s. at the unspoken agreement that the things they could not change did not require extended discussion. The farm produced what it produced, and Samuel managed it carefully, and they lived within what it generated without complaint, which was a form of dignity that cost something and that both of them had chosen without ever quite discussing it as a choice. Then, on a Tuesday morning in September of 2019, a car came down the road that ran past Samuel's farm, a good car by the standards of the road, a car that moved with the specific confidence of a vehicle that was used to better roads than this one and was managing with the patient capability of something well-made. It was not an unusual road for cars. But this car stopped and a man got out, and he stood at the fence line looking at the farm and then at the house. And Samuel, who was on the porch drinking tea, looked at the man and felt something move at the edge of his recognition, something that was not quite a memory but was in the neighborhood of one, an impression attached to a specific kind of physical presence, a tall man with a particular way of standing that suggested someone who had spent years in physical work and had built something from it. Samuel set down his tea and walked to the fence. The man was 50 years old now, grayer than he had been, and broader through the chest in the way that men who have worked hard for 20 years become broader. And he had the specific quality of someone who had been successful at something and had not let the success alter the fundamental character of what he was, which was a man from the north who had come south with a bag and a skill set and had apparently done something substantial with both. He said his name, and Samuel said it back. Abubakar Musa, the name settling into recognition the way a name does when you have not said it for 20 years, but have somehow not let go of it completely either. And there was a long moment between them that contained 20 years of distance and two different versions of what each man had become in that time. And the specific weight of a meal that had been one person's entire kitchen on an evening in 1999, Abubakar Musa had, in fact, gotten the construction job in Lagos. He had arrived in the city with nothing but the bag he had been carrying when he sat by Samuel's fence, and he had presented himself at the construction company's site office on a Monday morning with his references and his specific knowledge, and they had put him to work that same week. He had worked the job with the specific intensity of a man who understands that the opportunity in front of him is not guaranteed to repeat, and he had been good enough at what he did that 3 years later he had been given a supervisory role, and 5 years after that he had started his own small contracting company, and 15 years after the meal on Samuel's porch, he was running a construction and property development operation in Lagos that employed 80 people and had completed projects across 3 states. He was not a rich man in the way that the word was used for the truly wealthy, but he was a man who had built something real, who had gone from sitting by a fence on a road in Ogun State to running a company that built things for other people to live and work in. He had not forgotten. This was the thing he said first when he and Samuel had shaken hands and stood looking at each other across the fence that Samuel had built and maintained for 30 years. He said he had not forgotten the rice and the beans and the porch, and the man who had not asked any questions and had not made him feel like a problem to be managed and had simply said, "Come with me," and set a plate down in front of him and sat across from him with water while he ate. He said he had told the story many times in the years since, to his children at the dinner table when they were old enough to understand why stories like that mattered, and to the young men who came to work for him from difficult situations, as a way of explaining what he believed about how people ought to treat each other when the opportunity presented itself and they had the power to decide what to do with it. He said he had been trying to find Samuel for several years, had known the general area but not the specific location, and had finally found it through a combination of persistence and the help of a man in the local government offices who had known the Adeyemi farm by name. Samuel listened to all of this at the fence, and then he said that Abubakar should come inside, because that was what you said when someone arrived at your farm after 20 years, regardless of the circumstances of their original departure. They sat at the same table where Abubakar had eaten in 1999, and Adunola made tea and brought out food with the same unhurried efficiency with which she did everything, and they talked for 4 hours. which was not enough time for 20 years, but was the time they had on that particular afternoon, and they used it well. Abu Bakr told Samuel the full story of the 20 years, the construction job, and the long weeks on the site, and the gradual growth of his reputation there, and then the supervisory role and the company, and about his family. A wife named Hawa, whom he had married in 2004, and who ran the administrative side of the business with the same thoroughness she brought to everything else. And 4 children in Lagos, the oldest of whom was in university studying civil engineering, following his father into the industry, but with credentials his father had never had access to. Samuel told Abu Bakr about his own 20 years, about the children and the grandchildren, about the farm and the seasons, about the daughter in Lagos, whom Abu Bakr said he would like to meet, about the son in Abeokuta, who had become a master electrician and had his own small operation now. At some point in the conversation, Abu Bakr said that he had come with something specific in mind, and that he wanted to tell Samuel what it was and then listen to whatever Samuel said about it, and that if Samuel said no, he would understand and respect that, and they would simply have had a good afternoon together, and he would leave as a friend. Samuel said he was listening. Abu Bakr had, in the months of searching for Samuel's farm, thought carefully about what he wanted to do and what he was able to do, and he had arrived at something that felt to him like the right scale, which was not a gesture and was not an overwhelming thing, but was something in between. Something that could change the specific shape of a life without making the person receiving it feel that their own life's work had been declared insufficient. He had bought a piece of land in Abeokuta, a small commercial property in a good location, which he had purchased through a local agent and which was currently rented to a phone repair shop at a rate that generated a modest but reliable monthly income. He wanted to give this property to Samuel. He said this clearly and without elaboration, the way he had heard Samuel say, "Come with me 20 years ago," without explaining why or what it meant. Because some things were clearer when they were said simply. Samuel was quiet for a long moment after Abu Bakr finished. He looked at the table between them, which was the same table, he was almost certain, that had been there in 1999, a solid table that he had made himself from timber he had cut and seasoned in the years when he was young enough to do that kind of work properly. The kind of furniture you made when you had the skills and the time and no money to buy something equivalent. The kind that lasted because you had put real care into making it last. He looked at the surface of it and thought about the plate that had sat on it 20 years ago and about what his kitchen had held that evening and what it had not held the next morning, which was nothing, which had been fine, which he had managed. He thought about Adunola and about the farm and about the son in Abeokuta and the daughter in Lagos and the grandchildren, who came in the school holidays and filled the house. With a noise he loved and could not quite keep up with any more, he said yes. He said it after a long enough silence that Abu Bakr understood the yes had been considered and was not simply a reflexive response to generosity, but an actual decision made by a man who thought before he spoke. He said thank you, which he said with the same plain directness that Abu Bakr had said it 20 years earlier, the thank you of someone who knew how to receive a thing without diminishing it or inflating it beyond what it was. Adunola came in from the other room, where she had gone to give them the specific space that a conversation of this kind required. And Abu Bakr told her what he had told Samuel, not all of the 20 years, but the essential shape of it and what he had come to say. And she listened with the complete attention she brought to things she understood were important. Then she looked at her husband, and they had a conversation without words that contained everything that 40 years of shared life can compress into a look. All of what the evening in 1999 had cost, and all of what they had built since, and all of what it meant that this man had returned the way he said he would. And then she turned to Abu Bakr and said that he was a good man, and that she was glad the rice and the beans had been enough. Abu Bakr left in the late afternoon. When the light had gone, that particular gold of the hour before the sun began to drop in earnest, driving back toward Lagos on the same road he had walked in the other direction in 1999, the road that looked entirely different from the inside of a car than it had from the ground, which Abu Bakr noted and did not say anything about, because it was the kind of observation that said everything and needed no commentary. He had not been able to stay for dinner, which he had apologized for, and Samuel had said there was no need and that there would be other times. And he meant this genuinely, and Abubakar knew he meant it, and the belief between them was a specific kind of pleasure that requires trust to produce. Samuel and Adunola sat on the porch after he left, as they often did in the late afternoon, in the two chairs that had been on that porch for as long as either of them could clearly remember, chairs that had been repaired and repaired until the repairs had become as much the chair as the original timber. And they watched the road and the farm and the light change on the fields as the afternoon settled toward evening. Adunola said that she was glad he had given him the rice that night, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested she had been thinking about this for the entire 4 hours the two men had talked inside, turning it over in the way she turned things over, quietly and without announcing that she was doing it. Samuel said he had not thought much about it at the time, that it had seemed like the obvious thing. She said she knew. She said that was the point. The property in Abeokuta generated what it generated every month, reliably. A modest income that was not transformative, but that was real and consistent and unattached to the weather or the season or the specific negotiations between Samuel's body and the work it was still willing to do, which made it a different kind of income from any he had known before, an income that did not depend on anything he had to give. It changed the specific calculation of the farm's margins in a way that meant Samuel did not have to worry, in the way he had been worrying for several years, about what happened when the next bad season came, or when his body required one more revision of what he could ask it to do. It meant there was something solid underneath the soft years ahead. He did not think about it every day. He thought about it the way you think about good weather, which is to say you notice it when you notice it, and it allows you to direct your attention elsewhere, which is what good things in the background of a life actually do. What he thought about more often, across the months after Abubakar's visit, sitting on the porch in the evenings with Adunola, or in the quiet of the early mornings before the day's work required his attention, was something much simpler than property or income or the arithmetic of a farm's margins. He thought about the evening in 1999 and about the specific decision that had not felt like a decision at the time. The come with me and the plate set down and the glass of water while another person ate, the way none of it had required deliberation or calculation. The way it had simply been what the situation called for, and he had done it. He thought about how small it had seemed in the moment and how large it had apparently been in the life of the man who had received it. Not because Samuel had done anything remarkable, but because the doing of it had been exactly what the moment required and no more and no less. He thought that this was perhaps the thing about ordinary kindness that was hardest to understand until something like this came back to show it to you, that you could not see the full shape of what you had done in the moment of doing it, because the full shape only existed in the other person's life. In the 20 years of carrying something forward that had started with a plate of rice and beans on a table in Ogun State on a summer evening, in the story told to children and young workers about what people ought to do for each other, in the specific momentum of a life that had been able to continue because one evening, at the right moment, it had been given what it needed to continue. Before you go, I want you to sit with something. In 1999, Samuel Adeyemi gave away the last food in his kitchen to a stranger on the road. He did not know who the man was. He did not know where he was going or whether he would succeed. He did not know that 20 years later a car would come down that road and stop at his fence. He simply saw a person who needed something he could give, and he gave it without calculating the cost or the return, which is the only way real generosity actually works. Because generosity that calculates the return is not generosity but investment. The rice and beans cost Samuel one dinner. What it produced, across 20 years in the life of the man who received it, was incalculable in the way that real acts of kindness are always incalculable, sending effects forward through time that the person who made them never sees coming. You have, I am certain, the capacity for at least one meal's worth of this kind of giving. Tell me in the comments. Has a stranger's small kindness ever changed the direction of your life? And have you ever done something small for someone that you later discovered mattered more than you knew? I want to hear both stories. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.